Actually, what we say stress is, evolutionarily speaking, is our natural response to do something. Without stress, you won't do something. So when we have a threat, when we have a threat, if we didn't have stress, we are most likely going to sit there, think about the threat until the threat takes us over. Stress is what helps you to act before you think.
Are you someone who's experiencing stress on a daily basis? Are you stressed right now as you watch this video? Then this session is just for you. Today we have a speaker who is a clinical psychologist, and without further ado, let me welcome Navneth Mendis to GEPic Journey Season 2 Part 2. So Navneth, what is stress? Let's get straight into it.
So I guess maybe we can start by saying that stress is very misunderstood, and it has a negative connotation, but stress doesn't actually have to be that. The reality is that stress is a very natural process, and without stress you actually will not be waking up in the morning. So stress is a natural reaction based on a chemical, if you go down to the biology of it, created by something called cortisol. So without cortisol, you are not going to have enough motivation to do what you have to do. But stress is also like a reverse U-curve. By that, you have what we call eustress, and then you have de-stress. And when we talk about stress, what we mainly focus on is the de-stress. And because of that, that's when there's too much stress than what our body can handle. We start having different side effects. People, I am stressed, or I can't manage this. That is when it's de-stress. But most often, all of us need to have eustress. If in the morning you struggle to wake up, if you might not be having the motivation to do certain things, most probably one of the things that is affecting you is your cortisol level is out. So from a very general point of view, stress is a very natural, normal reaction that we all have. But if we talk about stress from a psychological point of view, the reason why someone would come to see me, for example, is not because they're having eustress. If they have eustress, life is going fine, they're doing everything they want. But if it's in this state of where it's toxic stress or de-stress, is where someone will come to meet me. And if you are undergoing toxic stress, most probably that's when we reach this point that we call burnout. And so simply put, to answer your question, stress is a very natural thing that happens to everybody. Level of stress that you have, how you manage it, determines whether it's good stress, bad stress, or whether you're going to turn to burnout. So psychologically, we kind of break it down into a definition. I'm not sure whether you want me to go into the technical details of stress.
If you'd like to, yeah, fine.
So actually what we say stress is, evolutionarily speaking, is our natural response to do something. Without stress, you won't do something. So when we have a threat, when we have a threat, if we didn't have stress, we are most likely going to sit there, think about the threat until the threat takes us over. Stress is what helps you to act before you think. It is what's going to naturally cause you to be like, okay, something's wrong here. I need to either run away, I need to either avoid it. And in worst cases, when the threat in front of you is too big and you can't do anything, most probably we freeze. So that's when I'm so stressed, I don't know whether to move. That's again another reaction of stress. So what happens is that, evolutionarily speaking, we have been evolved to feel stress so that before our mind can actually start processing, because the brain has different levels. We have a primary brain, and we have an emotional brain, and we also have a rational brain. So the emotional brain is the stress that we feel. And when we feel stress, our body is going to react. So that's, you might automatically start running away, you might hide. You don't even know that you've done. All you know is later you're like, I was stressed. So it's very automatic. What happens is this evolutionary process has also been part of our development. But unlike evolution, we don't have real threats in front of us. It's maybe the threat of submitting a deadline for an assignment. It might be that there is a boss at work that is always shouting at you. Maybe your parents are behind you. That's the stress. That is the threat. Now, unlike evolution, where you have a threat in which it will be there and it goes away, these stresses continue to be there. And how stress becomes bad is because these stresses, threats, continue to be there. Our body comes to a point of exhaustion. So, in today's world, a threat may not necessarily be in front of you. And where we get stress is where we might perceive. So perception of a threat or a stressor is enough to stress us out. So just because I think there's something stressing me out, it may not be the case. But just the thought of thinking there's something stressing me out, my mind starts to work. And how stressed I become and how I manage that stress is dependent on two things. So that's kind of a mathematical equation in which we think of how likely I think the stressor is going to be, what's the likelihood of it happening out of say 100%, maybe 80%. And if it happens, how catastrophic is it going to be? So you have that on the top of the division. And at the bottom of the line, you will have this thing about how much coping resources do I have? How can I manage and what rescue factors? So the balance of these two will depend and influence how much of how we perceive the stress. And based on that, your body is going to react. So for example, if based on the equation, suddenly stress is like very high, your body will go into an automatic, what we call a fight, flight or fright response. And in real life, because the stressor isn't going to move away, you're going to be continually stressed, causing physiological exhaustion, and that's when stress becomes problematic. That's when it becomes burnout. So, long-winded answer, but stress is very normal, but it becomes chronic when we don't have enough resources to deal with it, or we perceive it to be bigger than what it's supposed to be. So that, simply put, is stress, but it's very natural.
What a detailed answer. And I think anyone who didn't know how to define stress, anyone who didn't know what stress was, there's your answer. So my next question is, Navneth, how would one assess themselves or would know at a point, okay, I'm stressed right now, and sort of know, okay, this is time for me to act, or this is time for me to stop, take a moment and release that stress? How would a person sort of get into that position?
So, like I said, stress is supposed to be helpful. If you're at a point that because of stress you are unable to reach the goals that you want to reach, I think that might be the first indicator, right? So something that is helpful is no longer helpful. That might be like because you're so stressed, you're avoiding from doing so. Stress can also lead to anxiety. So because of the level of stress I'm feeling, I'm just shaking, I'm anxious, so anxious that I can't do what I'm doing. Another sign that will be is that because I am stressed, and the best way to kind of say it is, so think of this as your capacity. Each glass, each vessel will have a capacity. Because of stress, my capacity is going to be full. And as I fill up, this stress is going to overflow. So it's not only me, how am I impacting people around me? Am I getting angry? Am I being at this place of where I don't care about other people, I'm just dismissing? If there is an impact because of my stress to other people, that might be another sign. So it's not only me, it's also what is the impact this is having around people. So it might be because I am avoiding, other people are getting impacted. Or because I am stressed at work, I start shouting at the peon that is down there, or I start shouting at my mom, or maybe it's my girlfriend or my wife. That is another way of kind of looking at, okay, I need to get help, stress. The other thing is, not only does it not help you get your goals, it impacts other people, but how exhausted I feel. So that is the state of burnout, where because I am so stressed, I really don't look at going to work. I don't feel motivated to do things. I feel numb. So it's like where you don't feel anything. You want to feel, but you can't feel, right? So burnout can lead to depression, but depression and burnout are two different things. But burnout is the extreme level of stress. So if you're feeling burnt out, if you feel dissatisfied with what you're doing, you don't have a sense of motivation, these are some warning signs to say that, hey, I might be stressed and I need to check how much stress I have and what is the level, how can I deal with it, how can I empty this? And that's the best way to kind of look at it.
Brilliant. So my next question comes, so once someone identifies, okay, I'm stressed, I'm going through something like this, can they manage it themselves or do they need to seek professional help? Because given the situations in Sri Lanka, as you all know, there's a small stigma of if you're seeing a psychologist, there's something wrong with you, things like that. To a certain extent now these things have gone by, but I personally know there are people who still believe in that and they don't want to seek help because they think then people might think that they might have something wrong with them. So do you think it's important to seek professional help or can they help themselves?
I think we are all born with a natural blueprint on how we need to take care of ourselves. When we get stressed, one of the things that we do is we forget the basic things. And what I kind of tell people is try the basic things first and then seek professional help. But if you're gone to a point of where it's beyond you being able to even do those basic things, maybe that's when we need to kind of seek professional help. And so what are these basic things? It would be like, how do you connect with society? Do you have enough friends? How is your sleep? Are you getting enough sleep? I would say one of the biggest protectors against stress is balance. And having, it's like spokes of a wheel. If one spoke is gone, most likely the moment, so say you're a cycle, this is your wheel, you're missing a spoke. The moment you hit a stone, which is your stressor, it's going to impact that wheel. There's going to be a dent. If you don't address that dent there, the more stones you hit, the bigger and bigger and bigger the dent. So just like any vehicle, a bicycle needs constant maintenance, our body needs constant maintenance. You need to check in with your body and see, oh, is this too much? Am I taking care of myself? Am I doing the basic things? Am I having a good diet? Am I exercising? Am I getting enough rest? Am I actually thinking about myself and am I willing to say I need to take some space to take a breather? Maybe in our culture that we work, in the culture that we study, we are so pressured to do. Or maybe the threat that we perceive is that, oh, I'm going to fail. The threat is that failure. And because of that failure, we drive and push ourselves to never fail. But the reality, and I guess your previous guest also would have highlighted this, failure is inevitable in life. That stress is inevitable, so you are going to face it. Preparing for that is one thing. Working towards avoiding it is a different thing. The more you work towards avoiding it, you're going to stress yourself out and be exhausted because you can't avoid it. It's inevitable. And so I guess to answer your question, can it be addressed on our own? Yes, if you have this basic, what we call healthy lifestyle, right? Preventative medicine, and the saying goes, prevention is better than cure, right? So good healthy habits, relationships, I would say a human is based on 5 components. You have your physical, you have your emotional and psychological, you have your relational, you have your spiritual, and we have what we call your intellectual. There are 7, but these are the basic. If you have balance in these 5 spokes, most probably you'll be able to withstand stress a little bit more. So taking a bit of time to reflect and going back to your body will help you to notice, do I need some kind of maintenance? So yes, we can avoid. The moment you notice this, if you can look at where am I lacking in these areas and start doing things, you might notice your stress changing, right? Sometimes just getting good 6 hours of sleep is all that you need. You might have, because you're stressed, you're only getting 4 hours of sleep, running. And because your capacity is full, it only takes a little bit for you to explode. But little ways in which you empty your thing is okay. Finding a friend to talk, going to the park, going to watch a movie, doing things to relax, you can also empty this. So to answer your question, yes, you can. But if we are in a state of severe burnout, or we've been having stress for so long that our system has come to a place of exhaustion. So actually the body has a mechanism in which we have too much stress. So this, I spoke about the hormone cortisol earlier.
Yeah.
So the cortisol levels are supposed to be, okay, let me ask you a question. When we wake up, is our cortisol levels less or more?
I suggest less.
Okay, that's what most people will say. But your cortisol level is high.
Oh, really?
You need to have a higher level of cortisol, a certain threshold for you to wake up. Without that, you're going to be like, I can't wake up, right? But because we are undergoing so much stress and the cortisol level is high, your body actually reduces the level. And that's why sometimes it's difficult to get the motivation. It's difficult for us to wake up in the morning. Now, in such situations, we may need biological interventions. We may need medication. And I would say professional help and medication is kind of like putting a scaffolding. If you're fallen so far down, you need a bit of scaffolding first to stand up. With the scaffolding, you can do things. So there are two mistakes. People sometimes decide that I can only do this with medication, or I can only do this without medication and professional help. It's a combination. Once you get your own feet, once you start building up, we can take those scaffolding away. So again, to answer your question, it depends on where each individual is. Can it be prevented? Yes. If you notice you're stressed, taking a moment to adjust it may work. Sometimes we might need to get some help, but that doesn't mean it's long run. And after taking help, if we are not consistent, if we are not mindful about how I take care of myself, we might stress, I'm okay, stress, I'm okay, and this might be a constant cycle. So being intentional about it is equally important.
So I think this is something that not a lot of people put thought into. I'm stressed, okay, I'll get through this. The next day I'll just get some sleep and I'll be fine. But there are certain instances where they don't address the core issues, I believe. Because a lot of people these days are just very busy, have a lot on their schedule and so on. So if there's a person who, let's say, is saying, okay, I can't get this much sleep because I'm working till late and I don't have a time to talk to anyone, and they can't really get into these core habits to sort of push back this stress or to solve these issues, what sort of advice would you give to someone like that?
I think, and I must acknowledge that we do live in a very fast-paced culture. Many of us are in toxic work environments where this is not spoken about. That reality exists. So to say that it doesn't exist and you can take control of your time, I think is a false narrative. But even in that, there are little things that we can do to create space for ourselves. So for example, you have these breathing exercises. You also have what we call a 2-minute timeout. Small things like that in this vast, fast-paced world can make a difference. But I would also say that at the same time, prioritizing what is important to you will help you create those areas. Now, depending on where you are in life, so for say you're a student, at that point your priority will be intellectual. Maybe relationship component, and maybe even say your physical component may be a little less, because all of this has to be divided by 100%. So you have to proportion. So prioritizing is important. This doesn't mean that we have to every day work out. That is also a myth now. Just 3 days is more than enough. And 3 days of 20 minutes is more than enough for your brain to actually create new cells. So it's really small. I think we are also caught in this culture of go big or go home. Now that can be a double-edged sword. So to answer your question, can somebody, they're saying we don't have time, I can't do this. I think taking a step back to prioritize is important. Sometimes what may happen is that for us to take that step back to prioritize itself is scary. So taking a moment and saying, I need this break. I personally believe all of us are created to have an amount of rest. We need to. Scientists still don't really know why we sleep. We know what happens when we sleep, but exactly why do we sleep? It's something all mammals do. We know what happens, so we are like, okay, it's because of these reasons it happens. But what really is the cause for sleep? It's a hypothesis.
Isn't it to just rest, let your body,
That is what happens when we sleep. So we assume that is why we do
why
it.
we sleep.
Just because that is what happens when we sleep, whether that is the true reason. So it's
Very interesting point.
This is what happens when I sleep, so that might be why we are sleeping. But there might be something else, and that is something that is constantly explored. So based on the biological changes, we know, okay, this is why we sleep, this is why sleep is important. There might be more reasons, and that is something scientists are still questioning. Why? Right? And so even sleep, things like that, finding rhythms and routines that work for yourself, carving that time out, and simply learning to say no. And I think now the latest generation, I forget what is it?
Millennials, Gen Z, Gen X.
More than maybe Gen X, I think. I haven't quite got their lingo yet either. But I think they are more about taking care of myself. They are more about we need space. We don't need to do everything. And I think that's okay. Sometimes you can be countercultural and change the culture. We are still following the thing of you have to keep doing working to get. But it doesn't have to be that. You can create your own pace. But creating your own pace means there are certain consequences that you may have to live with.
What sort of consequences?
So for example, you may not make as big a paycheck as you want. You may not get to where you want to get as fast as you want. Or maybe the best example I can give is, say that I decide I want to study 4 hours, which means I'm going to have to forego instead of going 3 days in the week out, it's just down to 2 days. So there will be certain consequences, but the payout, so it's weighing the pros and cons. So even in this, I would say prioritizing that is important, because if your body is broken, if your body is at a place where it can't function because it's so stressed, whatever it is that you want to get, you're not going to get in at the end of the day. So prioritizing that is a better benefit. Everything has a pro and a con. Medicines also have pros and cons, but you look at what pro outweighs the biggest and you go with that.
That's
and
the
I
best
think,
option.
Yeah. And I think in this case, putting your health first is important, but also acknowledging that you can't fully escape stress. You can't fully escape from this place is an important thing also to remember. Because I think we also get stressed when we try to escape our reality. When we are not accepting of the reality that we are in. Oh, this place is so stressful. I wish it would change. You can wish as much as you want, but if you're not going to accept that it's stressful, and it's only by accepting that you will decide what can I do. Without accepting, it's just going to be wishful thinking. So I think first and foremost, maybe to answer that question, you need to accept your reality. Then you can take time to decide what can I do to get out of this. So acceptance might be one of the key things.
Acceptance, and I think acknowledgement that you might be having certain issues is important. Because once this overflows, you tend to look at, okay, this person is the one who's, having this environment is what's making me stressed. But if you take a breather, take a second and understand, okay, maybe if I take a step back, none of this would matter.
And it's true. I mean, sometimes we are not willing to accept that we are struggling. Sometimes we are like, they are making me. We don't accept what's happening to us. Sometimes it's important for us also to acknowledge that, okay, they are making me stressed. But we may not accept that I have these choices. So acceptance goes both ways. Acceptance of what I can do, acceptance of the situation that I'm in. Both of that needs to be there. just accepting where I am but not accepting the situation I'm in, it takes away the choices that you have.
So very interesting things that we're talking about, and a lot of new things. I think me personally and you as listeners are learning today. So if you are so far with us, make sure that you like this video, drop a comment, and make sure you subscribe to GEP 360 so that you get more content like this and you provide support for us to make more content like this to bring you valuable information in the future. So Navneth, another question that I think a lot of people have is work-life balance a hoax, or does it really work? If you just, finish work and you go home and then you switch it off, is there a switch biologically that we can throw in?
So I think that's what I've been saying so far, and that might be the summary. Having that balance, understanding the spokes that you have and how do you work. Our brain is one of habit and routine, and there is a concept called neuroplasticity. Based on what you do most, your brain is going to get adapted to that. And one of the things that we say, things like sleep hygiene or sleep routine, workspace differentiation from leisure space differentiation. Those are very small things that we can do to create that distinction in our brain that, okay, this is time to sleep, this is time to work, this is the place that I work, this is the place that I sleep, helps your brain actually switch. But if you don't create those natural demarcations, your brain is like constantly on the go. So work-life balance, I think if we take it, if you create a routine, I work from 9 to, say, okay, 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, whatever. And then you come home and you're like, okay, this is the time that I'm going to eat. Your body is naturally going to get used to the pattern. If you think about it, you might notice that if you consistently go to sleep at the same time, after a point, you start yawning when it gets close to that. Or if you eat consistently at the same time, you realize that when it gets close to that time, your stomach's, that's because your brain is working. So it's learned a pattern. It's learned a way to predict. The brain does that because to reduce the cognitive load, and because also this whole neuronal firing networks. So when we create that work-life balance, when we demarcate time, when we prioritize, your brain kind of realizes that, okay, this is what it is. And it's that work-life balance and aspects of that that will help you build a better routine. So if you're working from home, for example, we might say, don't work in the same place. Ensure you have an office space, ensure you have a living space. During COVID, a lot of people struggled because their workspace as well as their living space were same, so the brain could not switch. Actually, an interesting study was done that individuals that got out of bed, took a shower and got dressed, even though they were working at home, were more productive than individuals who just got out of bed and started working in their pajamas. That's because the brain needed that to say, okay, all right, we are switching. So it does work-life balance work? Yes, it does. It reduces your cognitive load. People get burnt out because they don't have that, and the brain is constantly, I'm working, and it's unpredictable. And when that happens, even if we try to sleep, we can't sleep because the brain is like, no, work, right? So does it work? Yes. How it works is by the brain creating these patterns and demarcators.
Basically habits.
Habits. And I guess even habits, okay, so since habits came up, what I would say is that, another question to you, how long does it take for a habit to develop?
To my understanding, 21 days.
Okay, that's a myth.
Really?
Right, so interestingly, 21-day myth is from a plastic surgeon in the early 50s who realized that after he did surgery, it took about 21 days for people to accept the changes in their body. That's where this comes from.
Oh my God.
Right? But in reality, it takes longer than that. And I can't remember what university, but there was a study done. And they took about 96 or 100 people, did a study, and what they realized is that it takes about 66 days, right? But you can't say it's 66 because in their study what they found is that it takes anywhere between 18 days to 250 or 260 or something like that. So 1 to about 8 months. And so the habit is going to take time. So why am I bringing this? Because in our fast-paced world, so much information going, creating a habit may take a lot of effort. And so work-life balance is a habit. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to do work-life. Today it doesn't work. The next day it doesn't work. That doesn't mean that you're failing. Your brain needs time to learn it, and definitely more than 21 days. Most probably, my opinion is because we are in a very hyper-aroused with and everything is instant. It takes a longer time for our brain to create new patterns, but it will. And just because we, again, another myth, you have to keep doing the same thing every day, same time, same way. Just because you skip one day or you miss one day, it doesn't mean that your brain isn't going to make up for it. So if you're struggling with work-life balance, if you're struggling with healthy habits like sleeping, what I would say is, don't worry, just be consistent. Coming back to the word of consistency, your brain will adapt and you'll be in a better place for it, but not 21 days.
So is it 66 days?
Roughly average is 66.
And I think I've seen this somewhere where it says consistency doesn't mean like, a set pillar, like one day you're putting up this version, might go down, might go up. It's just you put in the effort to do it every day. You are consciously putting in effort. Is that true?
It is. And I think anything, be it progress, be it mental health recovery, it's not always up, up, up. You're going to have
fluctuations.
But if you plot it across a graph, you will notice certain changes at certain points. And so maybe following again, maybe a myth or a fairy tale of it's always up, up, up. And I'm sure if you ask anybody, they will say that it's never about upwards. There is going to be places where you're going to fall, and those become learning points as well. So remembering that, and it's okay if I get burnt out at one point because I didn't know, it doesn't mean that is the end of my story. But it doesn't mean it has to keep happening. It may, but you now have actions that you can take to avoid it from happening.
That's true. So Nawneth, you being a clinical psychologist that specializes in trauma, what can you say about how trauma either leads to stress or affects stress?
So trauma can be understood in very different ways, and there are two types of trauma. Broadly speaking, you have type 1 trauma, which is like a single event traumatic situation, and you might also have what we call complex trauma, which is basically, it could be one situation that keeps occurring over and over again, or it could be a collection of different traumatic things happening to a person. So the relationship between trauma and stress, one way to understand that is, does everybody undergo trauma? And the question, I guess the answer to that question is that each person responds very differently to situations. When we undergo a situation that could be traumatic, our system first goes into the stress response. Now, how we respond and our capacity can then lead to what we call trauma. So what studies show is that when an event that possibly could be traumatic, an individual goes into something called stress or acute stress, right? And acute stress is where you are like shocked initially, you don't know what is happening, and that is based on the type of event. Your body will take a natural period of time to adjust to that situation. That is called acute stress. And what literature shows is that about 80% of people that undergo a situation that could be traumatic will experience acute stress, and then you have 20% who won't even find it acutely stressful because of where they are and the way they are. So when acute stress happens, a majority of people have the resources and the ability to deal with it. So a good example I can give is, say, a car accident. Now, some people might be traumatized by a simple car accident, whereas for another person it needs to be a huge car accident to be traumatized. But most probably a majority of people would find it very stressful, but it doesn't become traumatic. And what the literature shows is that out of that 80% that experience acute stress reaction, 20% will go on to develop what we call type 1 trauma or PTSD. But that 20% is dependent on how much of resources and where you are at that particular time in your life. That will determine whether it becomes traumatic or not. And so, based on personal factors, whether it becomes traumatic or not is one. And this is because trauma is actually very individual. You can't say, you were in an accident, so it has to be traumatic. No. A trauma is determined, by the event. So what happened, how that event is experienced by you, and how you experience it could be based on the resources you have. So for example, I had a car accident and there was a cop there. Immediately it happened, the cop came and said, okay, it's his fault, you have nothing to do. No problem. So your experience of the event will also determine whether it becomes traumatic or not. And what is most important is the effect of it. Now, sometimes because of that experience, you might have continuing effects. This is a very simplified example, but if you have to continue to keep going to court, if there's continuous things happening around you, maybe because you had the car accident, suddenly your father starts scolding you or somebody else starts scolding you, then that experience becomes even more worse. That can then lead into anxiety that develops into avoidance, and based on that, this can develop into trauma. But these three things, so the type of event, the experience of the event, and the effect of the experience as a whole will determine whether it's traumatic or not for somebody. And I guess that's where stress comes in. We are all going to get stressed when we have such a situation. That could, it doesn't mean it should become traumatic, but it could become traumatic. So that's where stress and trauma tie in, actually.
So that's basically what
so PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you notice, PTSD type 1, and then we have PTSD type 2, which is also known as complex trauma, which is where if you have a stressful event continuously happening, that can lead to more debilitating effects for the person. So this might be what we call adverse childhood experiences is one of the biggest indicators of complex trauma. But that's also if a person has more than 4, right? So you can look up adverse childhood experiences. It lists some experiences that can be quite traumatic, again based on a very interesting study. If anyone's interested, they can look into it. But that can then lead to also, interestingly, how you might react to stress can be influenced by your previous experiences. So studies have been shown in the US particularly that in the Black American population, their waking cortisol levels are less, as opposed to being higher than the normal population. And that is kind of tied into what they call either generational trauma or discrimination, which is also part. So they're consistently going through stress, right? It could be the same with minorities in this country. Or maybe if you're consistently in a stressful environment at work. So the trauma can also have those biological changes, which then sometimes because you have less cortisol, even if you're stressed, you're like numb, you're zoned out. You're not actually. So trauma can, as much as stress can lead to trauma, trauma can lead to kind of adaptations that are unhelpful when it comes to the stress response. And so that is kind of the connection. It feeds in and feeds to.
So I noticed you said mentioned the amount number 4. Is it that the threshold for it to become a complex trauma? Or?
No, that is kind of statistically. So what they've found is individuals who have 4 or more are more likely to undergo and have. It's not a magic number. It's statistics.
It's clear then. So that's very interesting. I don't think a lot of us knows that this is categorized, that this sort of trauma affects stress, and the other way around, I believe. And it's very interesting to know. So now comes, I believe, the best part of it. Now that we've understood what stress is, now we've understood what trauma is, how do we now go on to build resilience? Do better. What is resilience?
Okay, so resilience is a word that is used a lot in relation to trauma, in relation to stress, and the best way that I can explain resilience is the ability to keep moving forward despite stresses. It's not the absence of stresses, it is not toleration of stresses, but it's the ability to move forward. And I think maybe there is a way to understand resilience in that. Okay, so I've spoken a lot. Maybe this might be helpful if you stayed so far with the podcast. I'll kind of differentiate stress a little bit further, which is that stress can be understood in a few ways. It can be understood psychologically. So that is the mental reaction that you have to stress. The thoughts that you have, the way you're feeling, your emotional state, that is the psychology. So I'm feeling stressed, that means I'm being anxious, I might have a lot of thoughts about what's going to happen next, is this going to happen, am I safe? That's the psychology. You have the biological explanation of stress, which is what we spoke about, the cortisol, what happens in the body, your heart rate starts going fast, that happens. And then we also have what we call a behavioral explanation for stress. So when I am stressed, I act in a certain way, I do so. So you can understand stress in this, the psychological, biological, and the behavioral. So resilience is actually how do I counteract, or what do I hold to be able to manage these 3? And I would say that resilience is one piece of the puzzle in terms of post-traumatic growth. And resilience kind of, I would say, is a psychological component. There might be more to it. There isn't, I mean, as far as I'm aware, post-traumatic growth is what I have looked into more. Resilience is like a sub-part of post-traumatic growth. And so it's the mindset to be able to face adversity but continue to keep moving. And if I take it a little further into post-traumatic growth, it is that an individual needs to, like I said earlier, there are 4 key characteristics. Has to have acceptance. You have to accept that I'm going through a stress. You have to accept that I'm in a place that I am stressed. That is first. The second thing is they need to have coping. So remember I told about the psychological, the behavioral, and the emotional.
Yes.
So strategies that I use to help me. So it could be a mindset for the psychological thing. It could be techniques you use. Behaviorally, it could be what we call action, particular actions that you take. It could be like the routines that we spoke about, work life. That also makes you more resilient, but it also helps towards post-traumatic growth. And then simple things that I do to get in control of my body. So the different types of strategies or coping that I have to deal with a stressor. And then of course we also need to, this is for post-traumatic growth, it's not for resilience, have a good sense of self in terms of where I am, who I am, what I am. And there is a 4th component which now has slipped my mind. But yeah, so there are 4, but these are the 3 that I recall at the moment. And it's a combination of this. So acceptance, a positive view of self, the ability to cope, and one factor which unfortunately, the harder I try to think,
will, in case you remember,
the more I think, the less it's going to come.
So stay tuned. So there
it
you
may
go.
come. But you need these 4 factors towards post-traumatic growth. And so in terms of resilience, I would say resilience is kind of the larger picture. So if you are resilient, there is a high chance that you would have post-traumatic growth. But it doesn't have to be that you will have post-traumatic growth, right? It is where you reach after the situation. Resilience might be what I do while the stressor is going to be able to manage and how I move forward. So this is a controversial thing, something that one of my supervisors said. This is not something I have experienced personally, but one of my supervisors, when a foreign lecturer came to teach them or was doing courses here, what they said is, it's crazy how either resilient or unimpacted people are by, say, during the wartime, bombs going off, things like that happening. Now that could be resilience or it could be numbing. So there are 2 things here. Resilience can also be mistaken for numbing. I don't feel that it's okay, but it might be that I've just built a shield. Yeah. Or it could be that we've gotten so used to it, we're very good at coping. Now when foreigners come here, they look at how people drive and they're like, oh no, I'm having shock, I'm feeling stressed. But maybe we've gotten so used to it, either we are numb or we are resilient enough that we have techniques that we used to be like, no, it's okay. So it could be the mindset, this is people, I'm safe, I know that I can control the situation. So, but someone who doesn't have it, they may not be. So numbing and resilience again are 2 terms that we might need to keep close, because we might be numbing ourselves and saying, oh, I'm resilient, I don't feel stressed, but actually I have shut down myself to the reality. Whereas resilience would be, I'm accepting that I'm stressed, I'm accepting I need to do things, and I'm doing that, as opposed to I'm blind to all of this. And so when we are numb, then we start having biological reactions, psychological reactions, because we are not really dealing with the stress. Whereas if you are resilient, you're dealing with it and you are aware. So that's what I would say about resilience.
Coming into that same question, one of the 3 points that you mentioned, the first one, acceptance. How would oneself get themselves to accept, okay, I'm going through this, I need to work on this? Because in this day and age, there might be instances where nothing's wrong with me, I'm all good, I just go for it. But how do we make sure that we come to that point where we accept and we start that process?
I think it's a mindset. And actually there's a term in a particular therapeutic modality called radical acceptance. And I think it's also borrowing from Eastern philosophy of mindfulness. And acceptance isn't something that naturally happens. It is something that you have to cultivate, but it is something that you have to be intentional about. Now, sometimes, like the Johari's window, there will be things that we know about ourselves, we don't know about ourselves, others will know about ourselves, and places that nobody knows about ourselves. Sometimes there are things we know about ourselves that we don't want to accept because we don't have the mindset. Sometimes acceptance happens because of either what other people say or through learning we realize about ourselves.
Before we go into that, for those who doesn't know, what's the Johari's window?
So Johari's window is 4 quadrants of self-awareness. So it's broken down into what I know about myself, the part that I know about myself that nobody knows. So this is our secret life. Then there's a part that I am blind to but the entire world knows about me. And then there's a part that nobody knows anything about. So sometimes it might be difficult to accept because I don't really know what's happening about it. Or it might be difficult because I'm not willing to show that to others. That may be the part that I'm not willing to accept. So because there's no insight or light coming to it, I may not. And so I guess using that Johari's window, it's about how much awareness do I have about myself, how much awareness do I have about my surroundings. And I would say one way towards acceptance is being able to pause. And okay, this gets more complex.
Easier said than done.
Yes. If we are extremely stressed, if we are extremely traumatized, pausing might be very difficult. So it's not actually your fault. You might be wanting to accept, you might be wanting to do. But so what does the stress response require us to do? It is either to run away or to avoid it. Or we freeze. So you fight, you flight, or you freeze. Sometimes if we are undergoing so much stress or we've been traumatized so much, we may come to a point where just resting in our bodies or pausing is a threat. So because of it, we might not be even able to take that time to realize, oh, I need to accept this is happening. So that is also another component. So it's not as simple. And so it's because of this complexity that sometimes we need to get professional help. But for majority of people, I think attempting to pause will give a good indicator of how comfortable am I in my body, how comfortable am I accepting the reality. Because an analogy I use with my clients is, say you're walking on a journey and you've got this huge rock. The rock is in the way. You're like, I need to get this rock away because I need to keep going. So then you're like, okay. But you want to get the rock, you don't have the tools. You know you want to get the rock away, but you're not accepting that you don't have it. So you're going to take your hand and you're going to keep hitting. What's going to change? Nothing. You're going to break your hand. But the moment you accept, okay, I have a rock, I don't have the tools, then you start looking at what can I do. So sometimes it's about being able to take a moment to analyze your surroundings and then acknowledge your weaknesses as well and your strengths. That is how we can kind of start developing this sense of acceptance. And that's a very difficult step.
Something, even though it's difficult, something we should try. And
you should try. And it, I would say it's something that happens in little steps. It doesn't suddenly happen overnight.
Baby steps.
So,
rerouting back to the topic of resilience. How do we build resilience within ourselves?
how do we build resilience?
Is it genetic? Does it come through our families? Is it because of a surrounding, or is it something that we need to then practice and cultivate within ourselves?
I think there's a phrase that lots of psychologists love to use, which is called nature versus nurture. So nature is your genetics and what you're born with. Nurture is the environment. And what studies say that no one thing really determines how you behave, what you do. And we can say almost it's a 50-50. This might be a easy dodging of the bullet in interest of the time, but I would say it's a mixture of our nature. So that is our temperament. So there's something called temperaments. Am I easygoing? Or am I the type that easily gets irritated? And this is something we are kind of inherently born with. So that is genetic. That, along with how we are brought up, our experiences, what we know, these two together will influence us in terms of our level of resilience or our behavior. But we are also evolved beings and we are consistently learning. So resilience is also something that we can learn. So small steps, so say resilience in terms of stress, it will be looking at what can I do psychologically to help myself. It could be mindsets, it could be reading, it could be journaling, it could be going and talking to a friend to gain support. These things can make us resilient. What can I do behaviorally? What are the small steps? What are the routines that I keep in place? What are the boundaries that I set for myself and others? What kind of, I would say, goals do I set for myself in the short, medium and long term? Because resilience isn't something that you develop in one day. It's a long term thing. And then of course, coming back to what do I do to help my body? So behavioral things impact both the psychology and the body. And I would say these three are interconnected. It's not one is greater than the other. Whatever you do in one will impact the other. And so it's being able to do that throughout that will build your sense of resilience.
Interesting. So now that we've talked about stress, what's trauma, what's resilience, now I think we should sort of talk about remedies. what can we do to sort of either release stress or to, I'll do one better. I've heard, I won't mention some where it's from, but then again, I've heard that this could relieve stress. What's your take on it?
Okay, so I would say that throughout the entire talk, we've laced what we can do. There is what we call short-term or immediate strategies we can do to relieve stress, and that's where this comes in.
It's a brown paper bag, by the way.
And we also have long-term things that we have to and can do to help ourselves with stress. If I am to answer your question about the brown paper bag, there is actually a biological explanation for it. So there's a part of your brain called the brain stem, and in that there is a place called periaqueduct gray. It's like the sensor in the brain. When there is an increase in oxygen, and to be fair, this is something I've learned recently as well, is that it sets off an alarm. When there's higher oxygen in your body, your brain suddenly is like alarm, alarm, alarm. It's like fire alarm, right? So one strategy for immediate stress reduction or gaining, we say breathe. Take deep breaths. Normally when we are stressed, one thing we do is we go right? And we are doing that to actually increase the oxygen, because just like a fire, we also need oxygen to burn what we call ATP or glucose to make into ATP. You need that energy to either run away or to fight. So your body is automatically creating that. What happens is when there's more oxygen, that goes and it says you're stressed. So most often if you're at home and you start doing this, you will notice your heart beating faster, symptoms of stress. What this bag does is that when you do that, and that's why this is used in panic attacks, you increase the amount of carbon dioxide in your body. That slows down and that brings the alarm down and it slows down your system. So you're working on the biological aspect, which will then impact the psychology as well as the behavioral component. So this is one of the older ways that will. So now the larger long intentional breathing is one of the things that you can do. And I think I won't speak about the long-term things we can do with stress because I've spoken about it at length. But there are certain small things that we can do to relieve ourselves from immediate stress. One is long, deep breaths. Biology, which I just explained, to increase the level of carbon dioxide. It slows the heart rate. The other thing that you can do is that when we are stressed, you might have noticed that you're like looking all the way, like you're scanning the environment for threat, right? Scanning the environment for threat means that you are going to consistently be switching from stimuli to stimuli. So there's a technique that we call grounding, right? So grounding is a good way that we can use to reorient ourselves. And there is a neuroscientist by the name of Huberman. I can't remember his first name, but it's called the Huberman Lab. So he speaks a lot about the stress response, brain studies, the neurology of the brain. And what he has found is that when we are stressed, we tend to scan the environment. So the moment you slow down and you scan the environment a little bit. So this technique is called a 5-4-3-2-1 grounding. You can look for 5 things that you can see around you. So for example, I can see a table. I can see the cup. I can see the glass, right? So these are certain things that will help me to reorient myself here. Then I look at maybe 4 things that I can hear. So I can hear the AC, I can hear my voice, I can hear the traffic outside. So I'm using my senses to bring myself down. So 5 things I can see, 4 things I can hear, 3 things that I can feel on my skin. So I can feel the AC blowing, I can feel my clothes, I can feel the chair. And then we move on to 2 things I can taste and 1 thing I can smell. What we are doing is we are bringing our brain out of that threat to the moment. because actually stress is about I'm thinking about what's going to happen next. It's not really necessarily here. And if we are doing that and we are really stressed and there's a threat here, most probably we know and we've run already. Most often our stress isn't right here at this moment in this place. So we can kind of then use that. So this is one quick fix, or slow breathing. Or we also have something called visualization, positive visualization, where you can create spaces for yourself in your mind where you can retreat to. And if you are somebody, and this is something we call guided imagery, there are stuff on YouTube on that. The other thing that you can also do is, if because you're stressed, you're somebody that feels very, 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 very anxious, you can create something called a worry time. So in your day, you pick a moment, maybe half an hour to an hour, where you're like, okay, this is the time that I'm going to sit and worry. So you write all the worries in the world that you have in that hour. Once it's done, it's done. Then in the day, if you are like, I'm worried about this, you're like, no, not now, I'm going to take it in. So you're postponing your worry, that kind of down regulates your stress system. After a point, and if you don't remember what you're worrying, it's okay, you're done, it's still. What happens is we psychologically cling on to the threat and that keeps moving. So these are a few things that someone can do to help themselves immediately, but also long term. So the worry time is something we can do long term. But basically, if I was to give a simple answer in terms of what can you do for stress, I would say it's lifestyle management. Manage your lifestyle, your sleep, your diet, your exercise, and boundaries, and you can reduce the amount of stress, but you can't eliminate stress. And so, yeah.
And one takeaway, and as a whole, am I right to say that living in the moment helps you reduce stress? Is that valid?
Yes, I would say that it would. But from a purely biological point of view, it will help you reduce. But like I said, you're going to have stress anyway when you wake up, because without it, you are not. So biologically, there will be stress. But crippling stress, no. So I would readjust your statement. Living in the moment can reduce toxic stress or unhelpful stress.
So it's very important that we identify what sort of a stress we are going through as well, because health is it okay to term it as healthy stress?
Yeah, so we call it eustress, EU.
Yeah, right.
Right. So, and I would argue that most people currently don't do a lot of things because they are avoiding stress. And so that means that they are going to be unproductive anyway. So you have to have eustress.
So how do you actually manage that in that case?
How do you manage?
Manage as in, so you said people are not being productive because they're having less stress. So then you, as a person who might have gone through toxic stress or is experiencing a huge amount of stress, would want to keep it down. So then,
so that again, so that is the lifestyle.
As lifestyle again.
Yeah.
Okay.
So because if you are exercising, biologically you're going to start creating that stress. If you go to bed at a certain time, your body gets naturally adjusted to that stress pattern. You create the shut-offs. If after doing that everything isn't happened, that's when you need additional professional help. So
in a case, routine helps.
Routine helps a lot, because we are creatures of habit, and the brain, whatever neurons that fire together, wire together. So that habit will help.
So I think today we've learned a lot. We've understood where we need to take action, where we sort of need to look into. The smaller details matter, and how you react to things and how you look at things, your perspective does a lot to how you feel, how stress affects you, how toxic stress, as we learned today, affects you, and how you can overcome it. And in case you need professional help, reach out to professional and have these things sorted.
Yeah, so I would actually say that NIMH has a helpline 1923. You can reach out to that and get professional help.
We have this out on the screen as well.
Yeah, and also government hospital clinics are free. You can go there. There is a center called Navodaya opposite the NIMH in Angura, which also provides counseling services. I know Kandy also has a unit like that. The Jaffna University actually has a counseling center, and then we also have things like Sumitrayo, the 1333 hotline. These provide free counseling services, and anyone looking for, especially young adults as well, another place is Shanti Margam. They also provide counseling services. So if you're financially constrained, there are free services out there, and if not, there is also what we call there is another site called Kalyana. Actually, they provide a directory of therapists which you can actually go through based on what kind of therapists you're looking for, and you can find help there as well.
I think what we've learned today, and through all that, this episode helped you to either seek help or to understand where you are in life with regards to your psychology and how you manage your stress. So if you have a story where you went through such a time and you seeked help or you helped yourself in getting out of those situations, go ahead and comment your stories. We love to read it and we love to understand, and that would ideally help another listener as well. So go ahead and do that. While I do that, final thoughts before we end things. Anything you want to say to the audience with regards to these matters?
I think it is that no one is beyond help. And so if you're extremely stressed and you're feeling at a place that you can't manage, there is always help, and just reach out and realize that growth and learning to deal with stress is a process. And so just trust the process and be patient with yourself. That can be difficult, but that's important.
So thank you for coming in. Thank
No
you for
worries.
joining GEPic Journeys today. And thank you, our viewers. You're the one who are keeping us going through and helping us grow every single day. So keep watching and join us in our next episode, where we'll be speaking more and giving you a lot more information on other certain topics. So have a good day. Goodbye.